Sam Burgess, the Water Reuse Manager for SDS.
Sam, thank you very much indeed for talking to the Affinity Water podcast series today. Now, we're looking at your role in an innovation project that Affinity Water is conducting with Ofwat and Nesta called Water Neutrality at NAV sites. A bit of a mouthful, but just tell us about your role in this. I believe you're dealing with new technology and water at the design level of a building.
Yes, so we're looking at residential sites in particular, and SDS are involved as a partner for rainwater harvesting. We also are involved through our partner company, Albion Water, who are a NAV, who are involved in the project itself. So we're essentially looking at how we can make new development more sustainable and look to reuse water more efficiently as an asset.
And how would you go about that? Can you give us, we know terms such as rainwater harvesting or grey water harvesting, but how would you go about introducing those kind of measures into a building?
Yeah, so with rainwater, there's a few ways you can look at it. If you're looking at buildings as individuals, you can look at plot-based rainwater harvesting systems. That applies to commercial as well as residential, so that's looking at single buildings on their own. Alternatively, you can look at wider, more community-based projects where we can look at that water across the development and look at using it as an asset, using it integrated with the SUDS design, and actually looking at it from a holistic perspective rather than an individual plot perspective. So there's a couple of different ways, and similarly with grey water, really, it's pretty much applicable across the water reuse area.
So just to perhaps describe those terms to our listener, grey water and rainwater harvesting, what does each mean?
So rainwater is probably the simplest of the two. As it describes, it is collecting rainwater primarily from roof areas, capturing that and then looking to reuse it for non-potable applications such as your toilet flushings, garden use, irrigation, and also possibly washing machines as well. Grey water is a little bit more niche as a specific topic. So grey water is capturing runoff from your shower and bath, possibly wash hand basins as well, putting that through a slightly more intense treatment process, obviously given the nature of where you're getting the water from, and then also reusing that water for the same purposes as with rainwater.
So for flushing the loo, perhaps, washing machine, doing those kind of things that we don't really need fresh water for.
No, so obviously, what we term as, obviously you've got potable water, which is obviously your drinking water, and then you've got non-potable water, which is what we term as things that can be used with non-potable water, so water that isn't clean to the point where you could drink it. Depending on the level of the project and who's looking to take on the schemes would depend on obviously what sort of regulations and things apply to what quality that water needs to be treated to and how that water needs to be treated back into a building or a community.
And if I was going to convert my house, say an old Edwardian or Victorian terrace, how easy would it be to do that, to put rainwater or grey water harvesting measures into an old property? We'll then do new properties, but I've got an old property and I want to convert it.
Yeah, so retrofit's an interesting topic for water reuse. It's a little bit more tricky than starting from the outset, purely because of what we mentioned there with the division of potable and non-potable water. Obviously, what we need is separate pipework to supply those different feeds. It's not impossible to do. Retrofitting is possible on these buildings. Obviously, we would look to harvest the water from your roof area, so we need to look at the roof area available, the type of roof and what mechanisms you've got for getting that water into a collection vessel in a suitable location, whether that be above ground or below ground, and then obviously look at the feasibility of getting that water back to your toilets, for example, for toilet flushing or to a point of use in your garden for irrigation and so on. So each property would be individual, but retrofitting is a lot more readily available now than it ever has been due to sort of advancements in technology, obviously plant becoming smaller and space requirements becoming smaller through on both a residential and commercial level.
And if we now move on to your area of expertise, which regarding the Innovation Grant and Water Neutrality project, you're looking at design, so we're not adapting old homes. We've really got to, if we're able to cope with climate change, the challenges that faces for our water resources nationally across Great Britain, not just in the Affinity Water area, but across Great Britain, we're going to be water challenged. So we need to build homes from the outset using the latest technology so that we ensure we save water. Are homes being built without baths, for instance?
Yeah, so we're seeing quite a big change within sort of how new builds are being looked at from a water perspective. Obviously, we've seen that shift in energy already. We're now seeing it with water to an extent. Obviously, homes are trying to be built to be as efficient as possible, but obviously when we look at the data that comes back, Thames Water have given some data back to the market in terms of how efficient those homes actually are. Their leaky loos project, there's some evidence to say even these new builds are being built and there are some issues with their water efficiency. But as you mentioned, it's becoming more of an issue for the industry as a whole. We've seen areas such as Sussex North who are subject to water neutrality requirements, where for a development to go ahead at all, that has to be able to demonstrate that it is water neutral. So that involves, bringing down that initial consumption of water, using the likes of rainwater and grey water to offset some of that usage, and then also looking at offsetting that through retrofit, as we discussed, in outside of the development within the local area, to be able to demonstrate water neutrality. And the fact that water is running out, the climate is changing, and that we need to adapt the way we build these new developments to make them more water efficient and also to treat water as a more protected resource.
Well, let's just go for a stroll and see what this building in Hatfield, Affinity Water's HQ, can tell us about a new build and how we can adapt it. Are you up for the challenge?
Let's do it. Yeah, let's go for it.
So, Sam, where are we now? We're clearly outside because you can hear traffic.
Yes, so we've come outside, obviously, the Hatfield Affinity Water HQ, and obviously we can see quite a range of buildings around us in terms of development that's happened in this area. And obviously looking at each one individually allows us to look at different areas that we could potentially rethink the way that water's being dealt with within those buildings. So we can see some sort of residential development, so in the way of flats. These are, the one we're looking at now is sort of 3, 4, 5 stories high. So potentially if that was a new development, we could look at different ways to manage that water. We can see obviously the drainage falling down the outside of the building, collecting the water from the roof. So potentially that could mean we could look at harvesting that from a rainwater perspective, within say a basement or a plant room. We can look at reusing that water for toilet flushing. Potentially we can see some balconies there with some green areas, so there's potentially some irrigation requirement there. So we could look at that as a development, but also if we take it away from that building, we can see the number of people and the number of sort of flats in this case built there. If that was a residential development and they were individual homes, we could still look at that system in the same way, but perhaps looking at harvesting that water through a communal rainwater harvesting system in the same way that we would in a high-rise building, but on a single level. So combining that with SUDS, as I mentioned, potentially capturing that through a combined smart attenuation system such as SDS and Telestorm, combining that in with the SUDS, managing the flood requirement of that site through attenuation, but also harnessing that water back in for the same purposes in multiple properties.
And then to put you on the spot, how much might a family, say of 2 in a flat development like that, save with your able assistance?
Yeah, so on average we'd probably be looking at somewhere between 30 and 40% of your sort of water consumption. That would
Really,
be,
30 or 40%?
Yeah, if you think about what you're using there in terms of your day-to-day, obviously most people will have a shower potentially once, twice a day. There's a water requirement obviously with things like cooking and drinking, but most of your water potentially is going to be through toilet flushing, for example. If you've got even 2 people or children in your household, then you think about how many times a day that toilet potentially gets flushed, even with the likes of cleaning the toilet. We've got some data from hotels that we've looked at, where on average within sort of an 80 to 100 bed hotel, a chain hotel, that toilet gets flushed up to 9 times a day. And if you're thinking, even if it's a historic building, some flushes are still based around 6 to 9 litres per flush. Obviously modern developments mean that dual flush toilets can be as low as 2 litres, and even lower. You can get some that don't use water at all. But if that, even on an average level, if that toilet flushes say 4 litres, 4.5 litres, 9 times a day, that's quite a lot of water that's being used, not necessarily always for the purpose of flushing a toilet, sometimes just for cleaning. And at the moment we're using drinking water for that.
Well, then that's the residential block, and I'm rather blown over by that stat, 30 or 40%. But if we now go to the office block.
Yeah, so an office block, obviously, lots are coming and going in with an office block. Even with the likes of working from home, people are starting to come back into offices now. So potentially the requirement for water there is a little bit different to a residential property. Obviously, primarily it's going to be for drinking water for teas, coffees, or for toilet flushing. So again, could look at a similar style of rainwater harvesting system, but potentially that office block could have, I know we've got a gym next door, but if that office block had a gym facility, or you've got people cycling in, then potentially that's where we can start looking at grey water as a resource, because if you've got that shower usage, that's where potentially we can collect good amount of grey water from that runoff, look to treat it and harvest that back for the use of toilet flushing. And that's also useful in high-rise buildings within cities, for example, where potentially roof area is a bit smaller, so rainwater harvesting isn't quite as efficient at capturing that water. But potentially we've got higher shower yield and things like that. Obviously we're on a estate here now in terms of there's a lot of traffic from cars, but if we were getting a high number of people cycling to work, for example, that could mean that they would look to shower if they've got a gym on site at lunchtime, or even the leisure centre next door. That could be a similar case where we could look at the grey and rain water and see which one offers us the best yield in order to supply that water back for toilet flushing. And it could be that we look at a combined system that actually uses both.
And then, so what's your best stat on office water reuse then?
Office water, a little bit different, I suppose, but it all depends on your occupancy of your building, really. Obviously, especially with the way working from home has come in and the way occupancy is now much more variable. But in something like a grey water system, I mean, you look at the likes of BREEAM requirements for sort of commercial buildings, and if to hit those top levels of BREEAM, we're looking at supplying 70 to 80% of the toilet flushing demand. And if you imagine an office building and the amount of people that can be coming and going, even visitors, and the amount of toilet flushing that could see over an 8, 9, 10 hour day, you can think of the sort of levels of water that would involve at 70 to 80% of that water being supplied through your harvested system.
Right, well that's an amazing stat, but I'm really intrigued by the gym. I know you're going to have fun there, aren't you? Because, clearly people showering, people sweaty, as you say, people perhaps going on bikes. You can save a lot of water.
Yeah, so again, obviously we'd primarily be looking at, in this situation at toilet flushing being the real demand. But as you mentioned there, showers, we've got a nice big roof area, so either one of a rain or a grey water system, we'd be pretty confident to be able to supply most of the toilet flushing requirement for that sort of building from either one of the systems that we'd be able to supply.
Well, that's amazing. So from rainwater harvesting or grey water harvesting, you can save most of the toilet flushers at this gym.
Yeah, especially with the one we're looking at now and the sort of roof area involved there and sort of the amount of people you can imagine are in there showering. Even if you only get sort of 10 to 15% of the people showering, you still that's a decent number of people. And the average shower length at say 5 minutes at 9 to 10 litres of flow, you're going to get a good amount of water there. And if we're looking at that as an average, if you're saying on average 50 litres of collection of grey water, even with a system that's 80% efficient at treating that through back, you're going to lose a little bit through cleaning your filters. But at 4.5 litres of flush, as we touched on before for toilet flushing, you're looking to supply 8 to 9 toilet flushes from that one shower.
Gosh, well, you're a useful man. As you drive home, do you look at these buildings and think, I wish I could get my hands on it? We've all heard about converting our heating systems in our home, but it's not so much data about the water use in homes, is there? But let's go to that stat for the NAV site, right? So you're experimenting with the innovation, an Ofwat project, a Nesta project with Affinity Water, 400 new homes. How much are you going to save, or can you, do you think?
Yeah, so we're looking at this system that we're designing, and obviously we're implementing on this scheme. We're looking at trying to supply back roughly 40 cubic metres of water per day in non-potable water through the rainwater that's falling on that site. Obviously,
so can you put that into swimming pools or?
Not sure. I don't know how much water. It depends on your size of your swimming pool. But if you think of, if you think of 400, with this site is 400 homes. If you think of the amount of people that would live in that, even an average of 2.5 people per property, if we're looking to supply all of their toilet flushing, we touched on the levels of sort of toilet flushing available. That whole development, removing that volume of 40 cubic metres, I know it's difficult to compare, but you think of your drinking, the big bottles of water that you go and buy when you're on holiday, potentially where you can't drink the water from the tap, they're sort of 5 litres a go, and we're talking about 40,000 litres here of water. It's a lot of water.
It is a lot of water. Well, as I said, you're a useful man to know, but we unfortunately aren't all living in new builds. But 3 top tips, come on, fast fire tips for our homes. We know about the loos, we know about the showers. People are now talking about, we know about the ecosystems on our washing machine and our dishwasher, if we have one. Any secret tips, anything else that we don't do that we should?
I'm not too sure. I think if I can sort of take your question and shift it slightly, I think I'd target the 3 top tips as a something towards potentially the developers, if you like, because I think we're fairly well versed, as you mentioned, in terms of what we can do in the houses, and as I touched on earlier, there's only so far we can go without it impacting that water experience. But looking at new developments, for example, and looking at residentials as specifically, when we're looking at these sites on a holistic level, then the technology is there now to use assets that are already on site. Attenuation is something that SDS has got a history of dealing with, for the last 21 years.
Attenuation?
Yeah, so dealing with surface water runoff, so basically all the rainfall that's falling on that site, being able to capture that. Obviously, most sites have got what we call a discharge rate, so they're only allowed to release so much water back into the drainage network downstream of that site, so whether that be into a river or into Affinity Water's network. Each site has to be able to back up that water on site in an attenuation structure. Sometimes that's a tank, sometimes it's a pond. If you're living on a development now, you might walk around your local park area, you might see a big dugout area full of some sort of reeds, potentially with a big head wall at one end where the water sometimes fills up when it rains a lot. That's an attenuation feature. We also, as SDS, deal with tanks underground, but there's technology available now through the likes of SDS and Telestorm that is enabling us to harness that structure and repurpose it for water reuse. So that's exactly what we're looking to do on our innovation site. So we're using an attenuation feature that's capturing that stormwater, treating it and then supplying it back. So rather than needing a separate reuse system, we're actually using it as a combined system. So what's already on that site is being repurposed. And just to touch on a slightly different project that we've already completed, SDS has just been involved with a football club down in the southwest of England, whereby we've implemented a harvesting system onto their existing attenuation structures, and we're supplying water back for their pitch irrigation, and it's only been operational now for a couple of months, if that, and we've already saved them about 80,000 litres of water. And you can think, Devon and Cornwall are still, some areas of the country down there now are still involved in a hosepipe ban because the reservoirs haven't filled up enough from that long period of no rainfall that we had not too long ago. And yeah, everyone says it's been raining for ages now. We're currently still outside. It's not raining, luckily, but it has been for the last couple of weeks or so, if not a month. But those reservoirs still haven't caught up. And to be able to, as a client or as a developer, to be able to say you're having an impact on that stat and being able to offset some of that usage is a good thing to be able to shout about.
And do you think, we know to look for energy efficiency labels on a new home, do you think people are going to look for water efficiency labels in the same way, or do they already exist?
Yeah, so it's not something that exists right this second, but it's something that there's a company called WaterWise are looking to bring in, the water label. So that's something that I think will become a way to look at things, and it may even replace our sort of standardised understanding of litres per person per day. The water labelling may take over from that. They've done a lot of good work in that space over the recent times. However, I think that obviously there is an element of how efficient those fixtures and fittings can become. As a homeowner, as an end user, you still want what we call a good water experience. You still want a good pressure in your shower, a good flow rate. And so that's where we need to look at these systems as reuse systems, such as your rainwater and your grey water, and using those to supplement that non-potable supply in order to maintain that user experience and combine with that water labelling. But I think if we can look at water reuse, and especially on residential developments with rainwater, if we can see that water as an asset on a community level, and we can be employing rainwater harvesting as a SUDS asset as part of a holistic design for SUDS, then if that water is being supplied back through the likes of a dual ring main through the site, for example, so whereby the homeowner has 2 feeds into their property, 2 metered feeds, one for non-potable supply and one for potable, then in effect the homeowner may not even know that system is there unless they're told about it. Obviously we would want the homeowner to be involved in that conversation. They would need to know. And obviously they've noticed slightly different things about their water bill and the way it's structured and things like that, but ultimately that would be a fairly sort of intrusive way of doing these things. But also on the flip side, it offers the ability for those systems to be adopted and maintained on a site level. Obviously not everyone necessarily moves into a new development is going to be conscious of the maintenance requirements of such things as water reuse systems or even fixtures and fittings. Some people may not even know they've got a low flow shower, for example, or flow restrictors in their taps. But if that system is being managed on a community level as part of a wider maintenance regime by either a management company or even a NAV, as we obviously in this project we've got the NAVs adopting those systems as part of a holistic scheme, then that system can become managed and maintained, can be efficient for a longer period of time, and it can supply a consistent level of water experience for the homeowners and for the clients.
Now, you mentioned SUDS. Just explain that.
Yeah, so SUDS obviously is a quite a wide scoping statement, if you like. So we're looking at SUDS as ways of dealing with water on a development. So we're looking at that from a surface water perspective. So that might be rain runoff, but also surface water runoff from your highways, your green spaces and things like that. So water reuse as an asset for a sustainable urban drainage system, obviously that's what SUDS stands for. As a resource, water reuse can then add into that. It can assist with that flood prevention downstream. If we can manage that water on site, we can help with things like CSO overflowing downstream, which obviously is something we're seeing in the media as well. As an asset, if we're harnessing that water on site, we can assist with flood prevention through managing that water, stopping that water from becoming an issue for site or downstream, but also provide that water back to replace that potable supply throughout the year, so that in times of drought or low rainfall, then there's more mains water available, treated potable water available for that site. And we're looking at it then on a wider perspective than just rather than looking at SUDS as a flood prevention thing and water reuse as a drought prevention. We're looking at both together as a holistic approach to drought and flood prevention to help meet the problem that we're facing.
So we need policy change, and that would benefit a water-stressed area like Affinity Water in the southeast.
Yeah, 100%. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, within Sussex North, that water neutrality requirement that's been brought in, that was actually driven by Natural England and in conjunction with the EEA to look at habitat protection. So that's one driver. But yeah, regulation change definitely would help that, especially with the likes of community-based systems where it would allow for the adoption and things like that of those systems on a wider scale. Obviously, NAVs were brought in to innovate within the water industry, and to be able to do that, I think a regulation change that makes things a lot easier for not only NAVs and the industry, but also on a private level in terms of private water supplies and management companies, the ability to be able to know what water can be used for what and what the requirements are for that. Obviously, at the moment, we've got a pretty black and white line between basically all the water that comes back into the home or a commercial property is of potable standard, with the exception of a few niche cases on a commercial level. So there is that sort of gap in the regulation at the moment whereby no one is overly sure where that sits potentially, and we're looking at trying to fit it into a square peg into a round hole, for want of a better phrase, in terms of the regulation. So I think that's something that is beginning to happen, and if we see that come into driven by the likes of DEFRA, Ofwat and the DWI, we will see the likes of building regulations change to require buildings to become more water efficient.
And how would you then judge the success of the Affinity Water, Ofwat, Nesta, NABS project? Because you're dealing with part one of that project, yeah, which is technology. How would we know it's successful and when?
Yeah, so we're looking at, as you mentioned, we're looking at that technology element, and from an individual perspective on our site, we're actually using the SDS monitoring system we call our symbiotic network. So we're actually looking to instrument that site and that development to be able to monitor it and actually see the output, and the site we're potentially looking at is already one that Albion Water are involved in. And we can compare the data that we've got historically from Albion Water sites, from NAV sites, look at what
it's a new build.
Yeah, so the type we're actually looking at with ours is a new build, but it is a fairly recent new build. So we're actually looking at adapting some of the technology that is already on that site. So we've already got that, as I mentioned, that dual ring main infrastructure. So that is in. Each property has 2 water meters, so we're actually able to tell what water usage is non-potable and what is through potable consumption. So once we're supplying that network with harvested rainwater that's been treated back and supplied back into the network, then we'll be able to gather that data through our monitoring system, through SDS Symbiotic, and be able to tell you, what we're saving in potable water consumption by having this system in throughout various seasons of the year and over a period of time. And I think we're looking at sort of the middle of 2024 for that data to be sort of provided back. It might even be slightly earlier for this project to feed back into the innovation project.
And then just finally, Sam, that is going to mean, in effect, that Affinity Water has more water in its systems, so that in turn impacts on climate change and the environment. It mitigates climate change, and it helps us in turn to need less water from our chalk aquifers, which feed into the chalk streams?
Yeah, so obviously each site, this is a fairly scalable thing that we're looking at doing here. The idea is that this will be able to be rolled out onto other sites nationwide. Obviously, depending on where you are in the country, obviously we're looking at Affinity Water's region specifically now and around that area. But essentially, as a system, then yes, we'll be mitigating the impacts of climate change by capturing water at source in terms of residential development, reusing that water on site, as I mentioned, preventing that overflow downstream, allowing aging sewer networks to deal with less water than they would normally have been if that system wasn't in place. And, there's a drive on the country to build more houses, so ultimately that we have to provide more water. There's more people that need more water, but also we have to provide that flooding alleviation for those homes that are being built, and that land that was dealing with that water prior to, if it's a greenfield site, that land was dealing with water for us as a greenfield site. And if we're now building on that site, obviously we need to replace that flood prevention that site was offering. So yeah, there's a multitude of different benefits that these systems offer, from all the way through from climate change, drought, flooding, and also helping with other issues. I mentioned a few other media things that are out there at the moment, looking at sort of pollution into rivers, CSO overflowing, things like that. It's all out there now. These systems help with all those things. So I mentioned it's about looking at these systems as a holistic tool for a multitude of problems, rather than looking at individual problems in isolation and trying to solve them on an individual level.
All right, well, Sam, let's hope that your work with Affinity Water bodes well for water neutrality. And we're just going to get our heads around terms like attenuation.
Yes.
But thank you very much indeed for talking to us. I've enjoyed it thoroughly. And you're certainly someone who can walk around town and, if you like, vision our water futures.
Indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.